All right, folks, let's get started. If you're here, that means you've figured out that we're doing our lunch seminars virtually, starting going forward with the COVID-19 pandemic. So welcome aboard, and I hope you're all being safe and sheltering at home and protecting your family and yourselves from spreading the virus. So today we have Larry Schmidt going to give a presentation. He's going to be talking about technological innovation and labor market risk. He's an assistant professor here at MIT Sloan and been working on the intersection of finance and macroeconomics and a lot of the issues around skills and labor markets and some of the things we've been doing in the IDE. And so it's good to build some bridges here. Let me just take a minute to set some ground rules for the how we'll manage this. And this is a little bit of a new experience for all of us. So we may do a little course corrections in the middle, but I'd like to ask everybody to mute their microphones. And what we'll do is we'll use the chat to interact. And I'd like you to, right now, open up the chat window. If you go to the bottom of your screen, at least on mine, it's the bottom of the screen, an icon comes up called chat. So click on that and you'll see a chat window open up. And just go ahead and right now type in a one-line introduction of yourself, what your name is and who you are, and identify yourself. I think we have about 67 according to my list here, 68 is going up. So go ahead and identify yourself, and that'll be a little practice. And then, as Larry gives his presentation, we're going to use the chat to ask questions. I'm going to do my best to monitor it. Carrie and Seth and Jovi are also going to remind me if and Andy if I miss some questions, and I'll do my best to bring up the questions. And we'll just go ahead. You can ask questions during the seminar, and I will either call on you or paraphrase your question, maybe combine a couple of different questions for Larry, and we'll see how that goes going forward. But it should work a lot like our regular seminar, maybe even more efficiently in terms of getting people a chance to interact and have questions. I know that Larry's certainly interested in having questions, comments, and feedback on the research he's doing. So without further ado, let me turn the mic over to you, Larry, and take it away.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone at IDE for the opportunity to present. You know, my colleagues and this is kind of the first paper and what we hope will be a sequence of papers looking at kind of the link between changes in technology, changes in productivity on the firm side, and what's kind of the spillover effects to the workers. So it's very much still an active agenda. We're doing a lot these days with census data, and I know I've seen many of the IDE folks there in the cave with me, and I look forward to when the cave reopens and we can do that together soon. So, you know, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to talk with you more about this offline as well. The title of this project is Technological Innovation and Labor Income Risk. This is joint work with Leonid Kogan, Dimitris Papanikolaou, and Jay Song at the Social Security Administration. And I should mention, just for the sake of being careful, that the Social Security Administration does not have an official position on this question. So these opinions are Jay's and ours alone. Fantastic. So our starting point for this paper is a well-known fact that many of us are trying to make sense of, namely that income inequality has risen quite sharply over the last few decades. And also, kind of interestingly, if you look at the data, you can decompose this increase into both between firm components. So think of average pay for all workers in the same firm, and within firm components. So the difference between my pay and my coworkers' pay on average. And we actually see that a lot of the increase in the data is coming from this between firm component. Also, you know, if you look at the data, you'd see that for most people, by far, their most valuable asset is their human capital. So, you know, something like 70% of the flow of income that people are receiving is going to come in the form of labor compensation. Moreover, a lot of the sort of capital income is actually going to be probably human capital payments in disguise for tax purposes. And so it's really important to understand the determinants of the risks associated with what I would argue is the most valuable asset class out there. And there was this sort of traditional view that labor income was quite safe. We thought of firms potentially acting almost as like insurance conduits where they're insuring workers against shocks to their productivity. This is obviously to be debated, and I'm massively oversimplifying. But lately, thanks to the ability of fantastic new data sets, especially administrative earnings records, we're sort of learning a lot more and trying to open up the black box of why people's incomes fluctuate so much. And so, you know, there are many things that could move human capital around, but we're going to focus on one particular channel. And if you listen to the debate on income inequality, technology seems to be floating around in a lot of those conversations. And so our starting point here is to say that, you know, if you look at the literature on innovation, we've always thought about innovation as being accompanied by creative destruction. So the economy grows, but comes through sort of a rough process where new products, new firms, new technologies are going to come in and displace existing ones. And so, you know, even a very simple view of kind of what happens in the labor market, namely that if workers are going to share to some extent in both the costs and benefits of profits, then you would expect to see that workers are going to bear some of this cost. And so that's our kind of starting point. And we try to ask a very simple question, namely, how does innovation by a firm or actually by competitors, you know, with these creative destruction type models in mind, contribute to the labor income risk that individual workers experience? And to what extent does this also contribute to changes in inequality?
And Larry, are you also going to be speaking about to the extent to which that has changed over the past 10, 20, 30 years?
There's going to be a little bit of that towards the end. So what's going to be interesting is we can look at, through the lens of our model, a simple counterfactual exercise where we shut one particular thing down, and we'll show that this does help to explain the trends that we've seen. Moreover, kind of the timing matches up. So at the very end, I'll do some simulations where we'll actually show that kind of the trends in innovation and the trends in kind of increases in inequality are sort of moving together in a way that our model would say kind of makes some sense. So that's going to be my very last point. It'll probably be pretty rushed. But yes, this is going to speak to that to some extent. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to combine direct measures of innovative activity. Those are coming from the patent data and also information on listed firms with data on individual workers' earnings history from the Social Security Administration. And we're going to look at how the whole distribution of changes in workers' incomes affect how that distribution changes when there's new technologies coming out. And we're going to focus on new technologies developed either by the specific firm that I'm employed by or by competitors who work within the same industry. And here our definition of industry is going to be a 3-digit SIC code. So something that's interesting about the study, and kind of contrast with some earlier work, is that in addition to thinking about on average what happens to workers, we're going to characterize the whole distribution. So we're going to see whether risk itself or dispersion and changes in workers' income growths also shifts in response to innovation. So is there some kind of reallocative effect associated with this? And we're doing this because, you know, innovation likely has heterogeneous impacts on workers. It could make some people's skill set more valuable, others less valuable. And so kind of focusing just on average effects may actually obscure a lot of what's going on. Now, before I go any further, some caveats. These are statistical associations, not causal relations. We're going to argue there's a flavor of differences to what we're doing. But again, there could be other firm time-varying observables moving around as well. This is not necessarily about automation. We're thinking about producers of technologies rather than users of that technology. And risk here is just what the econometrician sees. So it's dispersion in labor income. It could have been perfectly forecastable. We're going to have some evidence suggesting that's pretty unlikely. But strictly speaking, all I can do is measure realized changes in people's earnings. What do we find? Find that innovation is associated with higher labor income risk. So what we see is that if my own firm innovates, that firm becomes more profitable, and average earnings are going to increase for the incumbent workers. So people who are there prior to the innovation taking place. Innovation by competitors is going to have the opposite effect. This is bad for my firm if others are innovating and my firm is not. And there's a non-trivial pass-through to the workers. And in fact, these pass-throughs estimates we have on the downside are actually larger than the pass-through associated with kind of own firm new technologies being developed. We're also going to find that these effects are somewhat heterogeneous in the sense that these effects are kind of larger for some workers relative to others. So if my own firm innovates, the whole distribution is going to become more right skewed. So good outcomes are going to become more likely. Innovation by competitors is going to do the opposite. The left tail of the distribution, so the likelihood of experiencing a really big decline in earnings is going to become much fatter. And the right tail is not going to move nearly as much. This turns out to be driven by people who leave the firm. So basically when new technologies are coming out, this is going to potentially displace workers from their existing firms. And when they find employment at new firms, their outcomes look worse.
Right,
we also see that,
to be clear, you can follow that worker even when they're not at the firm anymore. And so
that's correct. That's correct. So we can measure when they switch, and we can also see where they end up. And the other thing that's interesting is we're going to construct a measure of process innovation. So actual new ways of doing things. And we're going to find that own firm process innovation is actually associated with these kind of increases in risk that we see at the worker level. And then the final thing we'll do, I may not have a lot of time to...
Sorry, when you say innovation, you're referring to patents specifically, or is anything broader than that as well?
So our measures are all going to be constructed from patent data. I think the trends we're commenting on are broader than that, but the advantage of patents is that we can get the timing specific and we can attach them to firms quite easily. So for now, these are all going to be measures constructed exclusively from patent data.
Can I ask a question in the middle, or would you prefer for us to wait?
Sure.
Just send them by the chat room, Akshay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead and ask, but I'm looking at the chat room for people to ask questions.
Got it.
Like that question about patents was from Neil Thompson, for what it's worth.
I was wondering, generally there is quite a bit of a time lag between a particular patent itself and when it's actually implemented in the firm. Will that be accounted for?
To some extent, we're going to be looking at kind of long horizon changes. So to the extent that it shows up, we're looking at like 5-year changes in earnings. We even go out to 10-year changes in earnings. So you sort of hope at that time scale it shows up. But the timing of adoption is not measured perfectly. So the advantage of this is we can construct our measure for basically every patent that we have.
Great.
Okay, so the last thing, I probably won't have a lot of time.
One more question, sorry. And we'll give you a chance, don't worry. Sarah also has a question. Sarah, why don't you just say it?
Sure. I was just curious about the comparison of this particular paper to the Klein et al. Paper.
So there are going to be some things that are in common, and I would say that our OLS point estimates are very much in line with what they do. They're looking at small private firms. We're looking at very large public firms. So our kind of rent sharing elasticities, if you'd like, associated with own firm innovation are very close to what they get. They don't emphasize the risk component at all. So what we see is that own firm innovation even is going to be associated with increases in variance in individual workers' outcomes. So it's good for some, it's actually going to be worse for others. That's something that's not in their paper. And then we also emphasize this competitor innovation channel, namely the idea that, sure, if my own firm innovates, this could be good for me, but there's also this kind of pass-through that happens on the downside, and those pass-throughs are even larger than what they find. So there are some, I think, important distinctions and complementarities relative to what they do.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is the simulation that I already mentioned. Basically, what we're going to see is that there are these trends in growth rates of income inequality. Our model is actually going to be able to generate something with a similar flavor. Okay, so let me just briefly mention a theoretical motivation for what we're doing. I think the model that we have here is far more simple than what's actually generating the data, but it's useful to organize our thinking and also to just kind of give us a sense for why you might want to cut the data the way that we are. So we're thinking about firms as collections of product lines or jobs, if you'd like. And there's two types of labor. There's skilled labor and there's unskilled labor. And the skilled labor is basically going to have a moral hazard friction, which means that they receive some share of the profits. Now, innovation is going to be basically the arrival rate of new product lines. And this can either be high or low. And there's basically, for simplicity, we're going to have kind of two two firms competing with one another. So my firm can be innovating rapidly, or my competitors can be innovating rapidly. When we innovate, we improve the quality of existing products. And basically, most of the time, this is going to be good for the worker because it makes an existing match more valuable. The worker is retained. Now profits have gone up, and so their income is going to go up. But there's some probability that a new product is basically going to be not compatible with the worker's skill set, and so they're replaced with someone else. And there's also the kind of standard thing that can be mechanism that's present in this literature, namely that other firms can steal product lines. And when that happens, we're assuming that workers get fired and they're replaced with someone else. Once you're replaced, you receive your outside option.
And when you say workers receive a share of the profits, you're referring to only the skilled workers, right? Because the unskilled workers are all getting paid their outside option. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So the pass-through is going to be kind of higher for the skilled workers because they
higher, or do the unskilled workers get anything, or do they get zero, or they get some smaller number?
They're still going to be affected because they can become unemployed, but they don't have this moral hazard friction that means that they share in the profits. Okay, so what we're showing you here is just something very simple, which is just suppose that either my firm becomes more innovative, so product lines are arriving at a faster rate, or if my competitors become more innovative. So the left panel is my own firm becoming more innovative. The right panel is the opposite. And what you see is basically, on average, profits are going to grow, and then there's some mean reversion in this Poisson intensity, so at some point it kind of levels off. And you see profits grow and employment grows if my own firm innovates, and the opposite is going to happen because there's this creative destruction force. So my competitors can be stealing from me, and then this is going to hurt my own profits and cause me to fire people. Now, what's I think more interesting that we've added to this model is we look now at what happens to individual workers. So we're simulating trajectories of all the different workers who are currently matched to the firm, and we say what happens if the firm becomes more innovative. And so what you see is there's kind of we're following them, I think, for about a year, and we're saying a year later what happens to your wage. And so the average effect is, if you look at this graph, we show there's a modest positive average effect associated with own firm innovation. But what we're showing you here with these column plots is how different parts of the distribution of income changes move, right? So you've got, say, 1,000 workers associated with the firm. Some of them are going to be better off. Those are the people, say, at the 95th percentile of the distribution. They were matched with new product lines that became more productive, and so their wages are going to increase. Likewise, some workers are going to be replaced. They're here in the 5th percentile, and they're going to be worse off, even though the firm itself is better off. It has become more productive. And then here we're seeing that when competitors become more productive, that there's basically only the downside is present. So some workers are going to be fired, their skills are displaced, so on average their earnings are going to decline, and there's none of this sort of positive outcome that they experience.
So why do you think that the skilled workers are not being more affected when the competitors, it seems like they're, my intuition, which is wrong, I guess, would have been that they would have been very affected if their company becomes less profitable.
So they are. I guess this is a great point to clarify exactly what we're plotting here. So 95th percentile is not your current, where you are in the current earnings distribution. It's not about your wage levels. What we're doing is we're simulating forward paths of growth rates. So changes in wages for individual people. So what we're actually going to find is consistent with your intuition. It's going to be that the skilled workers are more affected when they're displaced. But what we're showing here is different parts of the distribution. So the idea is take a bunch of workers with similar skill levels ex ante, and then we're going to simulate forward ex post what happens to them. The point is that when we look at competitor innovation, it's the left tail of the distribution. The likelihood of really bad outcomes, the left tail moves, and the other parts of the distribution are not going to move.
And David Lauder has a question about that left tail. David, why don't you go ahead and ask it?
Sure. I thought that the low-skilled workers were being paid the market wage, so why would they be kind of imperiled?
So the fifth percentile is about a distribution of growth rates. So fifth percentile is the people who are in that fifth percentile bar. These are skilled workers who are displaced. But the point is, if I take all the people who are working at the firm ex ante, and then I simulate forward paths of their income changes going forward, the part of that distribution that's going to change is the left tail. It's the fifth percentile. So some skilled workers are going to be displaced. They're going to experience big declines in their incomes, and they're going to show up in the left tail of the distribution, right. Which is why the fifth percentile changes and the other percentiles do not.
Fifth percentile of changes, not fifth percentile of workers.
Exactly. So I'm going to make graphs like this for you with the real data. And the key thing to notice is that it's a triple difference. So we're looking at, first difference is growth rates. We're looking at changes in income for the individual workers. Okay, the second thing is we're looking at a distribution of growth rates. We're looking at, say, the fifth percentile of income changes or the 95th percentile of income changes. And then we're going to look at how that distribution itself changes in response to innovation. Okay, so this graph here is the most compact way we've figured out to show you that triple difference. But just to be clear, 95th percentile is about the right tail of income growth rates. It's not about current earnings levels. Okay?
No, I think when you're, in terms of presentation, it might be useful for those of us who can't keep up as fast to first do it on the percentile of the distribution and then work your way up to this, just so we can keep up with you.
Okay, so I'm going to do it in exactly the opposite order, so I apologize in advance. Okay, so what does this model say? Basically, on average, this own firm innovation is good for incumbents, but there's also dispersion that's going to increase because some of them are going to end up seeing their skill set be replaced. Competitor innovation is going to be bad on average, and it's going to show up in a sort of skewed fashion. There are some workers who get displaced, they're hard hit, everyone else is fine. And the magnitude of the pass-through from these own firm innovations is going to depend on the type of shock we're talking about. The pass-through is actually going to be higher for competitor innovation relative to own firm innovation, because even own firm innovation could be associated with displacement effects. Okay, so how are we going to operationalize this in the data? How you should measure innovation is not obvious. I know many people on the line right now have thought very hard about this. Our measures are going to be constructed using patent data because they do relate to new inventions, though obviously this is imperfect, and especially for certain industries, right? There are many things that are not patentable. What's also the case is that not all patents are equally valuable. We can come up with lots of silly ones. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the approach of Kogan, Papanikolaou, Saru, and Stoffman, and we're going to try to construct a measure of the market value of each patent. So the basic idea here is you look at any publicly traded company around the day that the market learns that a patent has been approved. You measure the stock price response, and that's going to give you some proxy for how much the value of the firm has changed. And what they show in the paper is that this actually correlates pretty well with measures of scientific value, citation type measures, things of that nature. So this is going to be our primary measure, though we have done many of the things that I'll show you with citations as well, and we get similar results. Sounds like someone's off mute, by the way.
Yeah, make sure you mute. Everyone should mute their mics. And there are a couple of questions queuing up, but I'm just going to let you go a little bit, Larry.
Okay. So one other thing to note is, which should not be super surprising, is we know that there was a big innovation wave that took place in the late 90s. So this is just aggregating this KPSS innovation measure and constructing kind of an index of the growth rate since 1985. And what you see is that there's this tent shape where, there was a really high level of innovation during the late 90s period. This is also going to be true if we throw out firms that don't have any patents during that period. So that's the difference between the index associated with, that's the blue versus the orange in these graphs. You see that you get basically the same thing. So if you'd like, blue is extensive plus intensive margin, and the orange is going to be the intensive margin only. So looking within the set of innovative firms. What might be less obvious is that this innovation wave was also quite concentrated. So here we're constructing dispersion measures, so standard deviation of overall of innovation across firms. And you see that dispersion across firms also increased kind of during the same period when average innovation levels were high. And then we have some kind of Piketty-like plots, if you'd like, where we're constructing the top 1% share of innovation. And you see that, again, a very small fraction of firms are associated with a very high percent of the total innovation that we see. And we also see that even within industries, that's panel F, that there was a substantial increase in within industry dispersion across firms and innovation. So it's not like all firms are figuring things out at the same rate. There's some winners and there's some losers. And so it seems reasonable to suspect that workers who are associated with the firms that are quite successful during these periods are going to have very different outcomes relative to the workers who are associated with the firms that are less successful during this period. Okay, so I think these second trends are maybe less known relative to the aggregate numbers. So we're going to come back to that in our simulations, because it turns out that this mechanism here in panel F is going to be the thing that's generating big trends in income inequality through the lens of our models, and it's going to actually get the sort of timing to work out. Because if you look at
yeah, sorry, there's a couple of questions queued up. Sorry, I was trying to find a pause there. Let's just take a couple of quick questions. First from Yurgios, and then Neil, and then George Westerman.
Yes, hello. I wanted to ask about your model and the negative effect that the innovation of a firm has on its competitor. In principle, we could have also some spillover effects. Ione Hovit, for example, in some papers, modeled that as the degree of imitation, which is an imperfect measure, which is something they use, for example, to derive the inverted U relationship. In your model, having this, let's say, not perfect patent protection would also help to mitigate these negative effects, correct?
It depends, because spillovers across firms and spillovers across workers need not be the same. So, it could well be the case that a new vintage of technology comes out. This makes kind of all firms in the industry better off because you can't protect a lot of the IP associated with that idea, but it could still make all workers in that industry worse off because their skills might be associated with the older vintage of technology. So the model we have, the way I view it is it's kind of a way of organizing our thinking. It says even the simplest version of this type of framework is going to suggest that we want to look at risk, not just average effects. It's going to kind of motivate doing what we do. But it also suggests that what's good for the firm and what's good for the worker need not coincide. And so it makes this sort of empirical exercise quite interesting.
And so this is Nim Compton here. So can you go back one slide? So when you're plotting the aggregate level of innovation here, if I understood you, you're plotting not just the number of patents, but the number of patents times this average market response. Is that right?
Yes.
So that's a pretty remarkable pattern, right? Because it's like the number of patents has continued to rise enormously. So what this is saying is that there's a vast drop off in the significance of those patents. And I guess, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that seems it seems remarkable to me that you'd have, this sort of exponential drop off in the value of patents in a 10-year period.
I guess that it's not the main, it's kind of the main focus of the other paper. So I would, I think it's more that it's not obvious that it's the drop off that's so remarkable. It's more the explosion of the value that you saw in the early period that might be the more notable thing there. But yeah, I don't have a lot to say concretely about the measurement there. So
maybe it has something to do with how the y-axis is scaled, and I don't know, maybe, it looks very dramatic going from 0 to 1.5 and back to 0, but maybe that's scaled in some way that's not as.
Yeah, exactly. So when I simulate from the model, what you'll see is that there's similar patterns of rates of change in inequality, and they're going to turn out to line up as well, basically saying that the late 90s was a truly extraordinary period in terms of what we saw in terms of new technologies coming out and also worker level outcomes.
Right, but you don't necessarily mean to say that the level of innovation is 0.
No. These are rates of change relative to 1985.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a rate of change of innovation. Okay.
Exactly. They're kind of like log indices, normalized to 0 at 1985.
All right, that helps.
Okay. All right. So what's our data set?
There's just one more clarification. I mean, I think George had a quick clarification question about, if you want, George Westerman.
Hi. So going back to the income growth distribution plots you have there, are those constructed ex ante before the shock, or is this some kind of measure of going across the shock?
So the idea is you take a bunch of people who work for the firm prior to the shock taking place, then you're going to simulate the model forward, and you're going to look at where they end up, say a year from now, and you compute the change in their wage from before relative to a year from now, and that's going to have some variance to it because some workers are going to be better off. They're associated with profitable product lines that become more productive, and others are worse off because they get replaced.
Okay, so thanks. I had a different interpretation. I thought you could interpret the left hand as the people who hadn't gotten raises lately, in which case they were poor performers, but it's different from that. So
that's going to be the 50th percentile. So a lot of people, nothing happens to them in this model. That's why the median outcome is 0.
Okay, let me just do a time check. You're on slide 7. We've been interrupting you a lot. Roughly how many more do you have, or I can hold off some of the questions. There's more questions.
I have a bunch, so if you can let me.
We'll give you a chance to get your facts out there.
Okay.
Hopefully, if we're lucky, we'll have some time at the end for general discussion.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so what's our data set? We're going to have a 10% sample of men from the Social Security Administration. So this is the identical sampling construction as a recent paper in the JPE by Guven and Oskan and Song, focusing on men for now because there are big changes in women's labor force participation over this period. We're focusing on kind of so-called prime age men, 25 to 58, and we're going to impose some minimum labor market attachment restrictions. So you have to kind of have really been involved in the labor market ex ante to be included in my regression. Workers are going to be associated with firms. So I associated you with whichever firm paid you the most in a given year. And our innovation measures are only going to be defined for public firms. So this is going to be kind of the intersection of our 10% sample and people who work for public firms that we can find. The match sample is going to have 14 million worker years in it. And then our kind of main outcomes of interest are going to be measures of age-adjusted income, kind of summed over multiple years. So the age-adjusted part you can pretty much ignore, but think about it as we're taking out like a life cycle profile on average. The main thing of interest is going to be we're taking, say, the next 5 years of income that you receive. So that WT to T plus K would be income from year 0 through year T plus 5. And so our main outcome variable of interest is going to be some measure going forward, what your cumulative earnings look like relative to some average going back. So this is very similar to the measure used by Otter, Dorn, Hansen, and Song. So our baseline specifications are going to compare your next 5 years of income versus your previous 3 years of income.
And this is Social Security income. This doesn't include equity or options and stuff like that. Is that right?
So certain types of equity and option-based compensation are going to show up. They're going to be there when they're realized, but it's anything that appears on your W-2 is going to be in here. So lots of those things end up getting reported on the W-2.
Right, but then there's also lots, especially the very high end.
Totally. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So there are going to be some holes here. But the specification, the idea of accumulating over multiple years is we're trying to emphasize more persistent changes in earnings because we're averaging over multiple transitory shocks each time we do this. Okay, so our main estimating equation of interest is going to be, we're going to take some outcome, which will be a growth rate always, and we're going to relate that growth rate to a measure of innovation by my own firm at time t, or innovation by competitors of my firm. So our definition of competitors is super simple here. It's just the leave one out mean of innovation by other firms within the same 3-digit SIC code. And then we're going to have a whole bunch of firm controls and worker controls as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to spare you the details of that. Okay, what do we see? So let's start with firm outcomes. This is kind of the focus of the Kogan et al. QJE paper. What you see is that when my own firm develops a new technology, these are kind of one standard deviation effects. You see that one standard deviation change in own firm innovation is associated with a 7 to 8 percentage point change in profit growth over the next 5 years. And it's not really correlated with previous profit growth. So at least this suggests that, you know, there could be omitted variables for sure. We're not claiming causality here, but those omitted variables are sort of varying with firm characteristics and time characteristics in the same way as the innovation measures. Likewise, we can do the same thing if we look at competitors within the same industry develop new technologies. And again, you see competitor innovation is not highly correlated with previous changes in profits, but it's very highly correlated and negatively associated with future firm outcomes. So basically, if new technologies are being developed by elsewhere, this on average is bad news for my firm, consistent with the creative destruction mechanism. Okay, now what we're going to do next is run essentially the same regression, but we're going to run it at the worker level. So we can say, kind of for the average worker, how much do my earnings change over the next 3 or 5 or 10 years if my own firm develops new technologies that are valuable, or if competitors develop new technologies. So remember that firm coefficient was something like 8 percentage points in response to 1 standard deviation change. The equivalent worker coefficient is going to be 1.38. I'll talk about the magnitudes in just a second. One other thing that's notable is we can split workers based on whether they stay with the firm over the next 3 years or whether they leave the firm within the next 3 years. And you see that this elasticity is purely driven by the stayers. So for people who leave the firm, there's basically no discernible change in their own earnings growth in response to firm innovation. Then if we look at competitor innovation, what we see, again, this was bad for the firm, it's also bad for the workers. So a 1 standard deviation change in competitor innovation is associated with about a 1.9 percentage point reduction in a worker's income change over the next 5 years. This estimate, I think, is new to the literature. We haven't seen it anywhere. And what's interesting is that these effects are actually going to be larger for the workers who leave the firm. So if you want, you can kind of take the ratio of these two coefficients and you'll get something analogous to a rent sharing elasticity. And what we get is for stayers, there's lots of estimates of this in the literature, an elasticity of around 20%, which is in line with the Klein et al. Paper that you asked about earlier. These rent sharing elasticities are actually even larger in response to kind of the adverse effects associated with competitor innovation. So the pass-through, especially for people who leave the firms, is actually considerably larger for those. Okay, so we think about the ratio of these two coefficients. Again, if we get one of 0.17, that's our overall number. That would say that employees capture something like 17% of the benefits of innovations. And so there is some sharing of this between workers and firms.
And so Larry, this might be a good time. David Otter was asking, how exactly are you defining the profits so that we know what those ratios are?
It's a pretty high level version. It's basically sales minus cost of goods sold. I think there might be one other category taken out. It's the same definition as the QJE paper. So it's a pretty high level profit.
Pretty
measure.
Broad measure, you're saying.
Yeah,
might
exactly.
Be overly inclusive. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
So that might be even higher.
Could be. Okay, so this suggests that there's some, pass-through consistent with a lot of estimates from the literature, but something that the model suggests is that the benefits and costs of these outcomes need not be symmetrically distributed across incumbent workers. In fact, even that very simple model that was missing lots of realistic features would say that you would expect effects to be sort of heterogeneous across people. So what we're going to do next is we're going to model how the entire distribution of earnings growth changes following innovation. And for this, we're going to use a quantile regression technology. So I'll spare you the details, but basically this is an approach that I've been using in another paper with Yin-Chu Zhu. It's a functional form we like to think about capturing how multiple quantiles move around jointly. And you can motivate this functional form using the changes and changes framework proposed by Athey and Imbens. So let me just keep going so we'll look at the outcomes rather than how exactly we would produce these numbers.
Yeah, and just FYI, there are some questions piling up. I'm letting them sit a little bit now, but because I want to give you a chance to do this. But if you can time it so we have some time for people to ask questions, that would be great.
Okay, that sounds good. So let me, if it's okay, I'll go through the main effects, and then we have a bunch of heterogeneous things that I can just describe verbally, and then we can take some questions. But if there are clarifying questions about what I'm showing to you right after the next 2 slides, then we should stop and take them. Okay, so what this is showing is I'm basically estimating for each worker, based on their ex ante characteristics, a model of the whole CDF of changes in earnings growth. So if you look at the right panel, this would basically say, how does the median outcome change? How does the 75th percentile, the 90th, and the 95th? How does each one of these points on the CDF change if my own firm develops a new technology? Specifically, if that own firm innovation measure is 1 standard deviation larger. And what you see is that our estimated CDF is going to sort of shift to the right. So the lower outcomes don't really change. The good outcomes, the 95th percentile, so think of this as like big raises, things of that nature, is going to shift to the right. Okay, so what I'm showing you on the left panel, this is what you'll see for most of the rest of the talk, is basically how much each one of these percentiles is moving in response to 1 standard deviation change. So the median income growth rate is changing by about 1 percentage point if my own firm has a 1 standard deviation larger innovation shock. In contrast, if you look at the 95th percentile, so again, these are like good outcomes from the worker's perspective, the 95th percentile is shifting much more than the median outcome. Okay, so kind of this is unambiguously good for any worker, regardless of their risk preferences. The whole distribution is shifting to the right. If we do the same thing with respect to the competitor innovation, what you see is the opposite. So again, I have an estimate of the whole CDF of workers' income changes, and it's kind of stretching out to the left. So basically, bad outcomes become more likely and worse following competitor innovation. So again, so here the left tail, or downside risk, is going up relative to the kind of median or right tail of the distribution. Okay.
And just to clarify there, Daniela Skur was asking, those separations combine both quits and people being fired, right?
Yes, we have no way of observing that. So all we can do is we can see whether a worker leaves the firm or not. In the paper, we have some estimates of kind of really bad outcomes. So the number of years that someone has 0 W-2 earnings. And we can also look at applications for Social Security disability insurance. We're going to see that actually both of those are going to increase, suggesting that it's unlikely that this is all just quits. There's probably some element of involuntary unemployment here, but we can't separate those things.
Right. Yeah, Daniela has some ideas on that, but she can talk to you later.
Perfect. Okay, so again, what you see is kind of, it's not just a location shift of the CDF. It's not like all parts of the distribution, all workers are being affected symmetrically. Rather, we see own firm innovation is kind of making the distribution more right skewed. Competitor innovation is making the distribution more left skewed. Okay, we can also do this for different horizons. So what I was showing you was next 5 years of income relative to your previous 3. We do it with 3-year, 5-year, or 10-year growth rates. And what we end up finding is kind of qualitatively similar across these different horizons. This suggests also that these effects are fairly permanent. Okay, so just let me say one thing about the magnitudes. The point estimates might seem small, and that's fine. I mean, we can only measure one very small fraction of the innovation that's happening. In reality, technology is changing for many, many other reasons. But keep in mind, workers are risk averse, we think. You have essentially no way of diversifying away labor income risk, and these shocks appear to be permanent. So suppose, just for the sake of the argument, that consumption was to fall kind of by similar magnitudes as income. So it's like people are hand to mouth on average. If a worker had a CRA coefficient of 5, this suggests that they would experience a 3.4% reduction in their lifetime utility through a 1 standard deviation shock to innovation by competing firms. That's a pretty big number. That's comparable to the estimated cost of business cycles that Krebs estimated due to job displacement. And if you compare that effect with the assumption that workers are risk neutral, which is essentially what you'd be assuming if you only looked at average effects, this is almost 3 times larger. So that average effect would be more like 1.1%. Okay, so that suggests that actually these changes in risk workers really dislike, and it can actually change kind of whether they would even see innovation as a good or a bad thing. Okay, so thus far what I've showed you is that innovation is followed by shifts in the whole distribution of worker income. Own firm innovation is associated with more right skewness. Competitor innovation is associated with more left skewness. This could just be driven by the fact that different people have different exposures. And so what we're going to do next is just a very simple sort based on prior income levels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the workers in the firm and I'm going to sort them roughly into quartiles. So I take the bottom 25%, then the 25th through 50th percent, and so on. And sorry, this is a typo. This should be 50 to 75. So I'll basically take 4 quartiles, and then I'll actually take the top quartile, 75 to 100, and I'll split that into 75 to 95 versus 95 to 100. Okay, and so what I'm showing you now is that same graph, except I'm allowing the effects to differ across income bands. So white is the lowest paid workers. So I might use the word skill to describe them, low skilled workers. And the dark colors are going to be the highest skilled workers within the firm. Okay, and what we see that's quite interesting is that if we look at own firm innovation, say the median effect for someone in the top 5% within their firm is similar to the effect for someone who's in the 75th to 95th percent. But then if you look at the tails, both tails are moving, right? So the 95th percentile is shifting to the right by more for the high skilled workers relative to everyone else. But there's also this increase in downside risk. So for some high skilled workers, own firm innovation is actually going to turn out to make them worse off because the 5th percentile is shifting downwards. And so some extra cuts.
You might think that they have more firm specific skills that they're, is that sort of what
exactly. They might have more firm specific or vintage specific human capital.
Yeah,
and so
better, yeah.
Yeah, so even my own firm developing new technologies could make me worse off. What I have later in the slide deck that I won't get to is we'll see that actually this is driven by process-oriented innovations. So we do a bit of textual analysis on the patents and we find that it's these process patents that are landing people in this zone.
You don't need the draftsman anymore when you install CAD systems. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so new ways of doing things seem to be more correlated with adverse worker outcomes. You see the same thing with citations and measures of novelty that we've constructed using textual analysis. Okay, so here's the same graph. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, these black bars for the highest skilled workers, this is basically saying on average it's good, but you see that the variance of the distribution is also increasing because the right tail is moving up by more than the median, the 95th versus the median, but the left tail is also getting fatter because the difference between the median and the 5th percentile is also growing in response to innovation. If we look at competitor innovation, actually what it seems like here is that these high skilled workers are just much worse off and in a nasty way, in the sense that the difference between the median outcome and the 95th percentile is not very large, but the left tail is actually becoming considerably fatter for these high skilled workers. So again, this is consistent with if you have a lot of skills, your skill set may be more likely to be displaced following innovations. Also, these are workers for whom you might think this sort of moral hazard friction would mean that there's more profit sharing going on between these workers and their firms. So just to summarize, what it looks like, which is quite interesting, is that these top workers actually have a higher exposure to innovation shocks. And the magnitudes are quite large again. So if I look at how much this black bar is shifting downwards in response to competitor innovation, this is actually comparable to the difference that Guven and Özkan and Song estimated in how much the left tail of worker level income growth rates move between expansions and recessions. This would say that a top worker with a CRA coefficient of 5 would experience an 11% reduction in their lifetime utility following a 1 standard deviation shock. So these are kind of very large magnitudes, we would argue. Okay, we do some things conditioning on age. The other thing that I'd just like to say that we emphasize in the paper is that innovation appears to be somewhat special in the sense that I can look at other firm and competitor outcomes, and I don't see these adverse effects. So here we're taking advantage of the fact that these firms are publicly traded, and we're estimating the same coefficients for own firm or competitor stock returns. And perhaps the own firm coefficient looks somewhat similar in that the distribution becomes more right skewed, but competitor stock returns on average is actually going to be somewhat good for workers. And we can do the same thing with profits. So if my competitors become more profitable, conditional on my own firm profit growth, this is mostly a neutral outcome from the perspective of individual workers. Maybe it's associated with a modest reduction in downside risk for low-skilled workers. Okay, so in the rest of the paper, I'm not going to have time to show you this. We kind of dig a bit more in to see what's going on. What we're going to find is basically that our effects are driven by people who leave the firm. So these bad outcomes following innovation are particularly severe for people who actually leave their firms. And workers become more likely to leave following innovation. And then we're also going to see that it's these sort of particular types of innovations. So process-oriented innovations are going to look worse. Those are some of the main things that I'm going to now blast through. So
right,
here I go.
About 5 minutes. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So the last thing I just wanted to show you a graph of is we asked the simple question of how much did the change in innovation across firms, can that help explain what we see happening with the rise in income inequality? Right, so everything I showed you was about growth rates. It was about changes in workers' incomes. But I observed workers' income levels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our model of growth rates. I'm going to combine it with lagged earnings levels, which allows me to simulate new levels of income inequality. And then I can do some simple counterfactuals. These are not like structural counterfactuals, but they help us to interpret the magnitudes associated with our coefficients. Because one thing that I showed you, remember, is that innovation across firms, even within the same industry, was quite concentrated. So some firms were figuring things out and many firms were left behind. What this means is that if workers are associated with these same shocks, there's going to be an increase in dispersion across workers and their outcomes. And so what we're going to do is think about what the model says happens given the observed distribution of innovation versus a simple counterfactual, where we just suppose that all firms within the same industry innovate at the same rate. So I'm going to replace AF, my own innovation measure, and my competitor innovation measure with just the average across firms within the same industry and year. And what's quite interesting is what we see is that actually this helps to explain the change that we see in the right tail of the income distribution. So the growth of kind of very high incomes. And the timing sort of matches up. So the orange is the realized change in the right tail of the cross-sectional distribution of labor income from the raw data. That's the orange line. And you see that our counterfactual also predicts that if you were to shut off dispersion across firms and innovation, the growth rate of inequality would have been considerably lower. So this suggests that this might actually, the mechanisms that we're proposing could help to explain some of what we see happening at the very top of the income distribution. If we do this decomposing into between firm and within firm effects, we also see that it helps explain increases in both between firm and within firm inequality. So let me stop talking in case we want to take a couple last questions. What we find is that innovation is associated with considerable labor income risk. It suggests that workers who have very little means to diversify against these shocks bear a substantial share of the costs of creative destruction. This turns out to be higher for top workers driven by separations, and when even kind of own firm innovations can be associated with bad outcomes, especially those associated with process innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very appreciate it. That's really interesting stuff. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions. I think maybe some of these are from a while ago. I hope there's still people who want to ask these. But so Amy Glassmeyer had a question about the types of innovation. I mean, there's a few people who commented about the word innovation versus the word patents, but I think Amy wants to ask about that. Amy Glassmeyer. she's there.
I just am curious about the kind of firm you believe you're describing and the actual innovation or technology that's being applied that's leading to the outcome.
Okay, so these are publicly traded firms. So there's going to be some differences in industry composition, which are correlated with the decision to be public. So you're going to see probably a higher share of manufacturing, perhaps, certain types of high-tech services. So it might be the case that in this particular sample, it's more likely that the people getting the patent are also the ones using the patent. But we don't really know. We've done a little bit across industries, at least. So I've looked at, say, high-tech industries versus other industries. So we took out the top third of SIC 3-digit codes based on their level of innovation. You see that these effects are more pronounced in the high-tech sector. But yeah, I think it might be more plausible that in these particular cases, it's a firm that develops the technology is also the one that's going to deploy the technology, which might be why we pick up the worker level outcomes. In some of the stuff we're doing going forward, we're using occupation data and other things and trying to get at the question of adoption, because the types of effects we document may be more relevant for producers of technology. And I think there's a related set of questions for adopters of technology. And there you might think that it's actually the low-skilled workers who are more exposed. But I don't actually know the answer to the question, so we're looking forward to
Have you thought about doing some case studies to essentially set up your hypothesis in a more empirically driven way?
So if you have some that you suggest, we're all ears. The advantage of this method—
I lifted a series of technologies that were developed right around the time that you are seeing that peak. And some of them are very specific, like the Hubble telescope, but some of them are transformative capabilities, such as the development of the capacity for near field communication, which would have had a more generalized effect across industries as a whole, depending upon whether they were in telecom or not. So it just seems like you could get some really interesting insights into who might have done something and the reasons why.
Right. And so Amy has a whole list of things in the chat that she can share with you of possible technologies. Let me just try and get in one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Arnie also had a question a little bit related to patents and innovation. Some industries like pharmaceuticals may be much more linked to patent-based innovation and others less so. Arnie, do you want to ask that question?
Okay, so I mean, I think, so what we do see is that in the industry, so this split that I mentioned, we compute the ratio of market value of patents to the size of the firm's assets. And we do see that this is more pronounced in industries where patenting is more expensive, or sorry, is more important.
Yeah, makes sense.
So that seems reasonable. I do believe that this is happening in services, but it may not be patented in services.
Right. Okay, we are actually out of time. So thank you very much. Your paper is available. Is it on your website, or if people want to read more?
Yes.
Yeah. So a copy of your paper on your website, Larry Schmidt. And in 2 weeks, I believe we have our next virtual seminar, which is on April 1st. We have Yo Shavit and Yorgos Petropoulos will be splitting the time and doing back-to-back presentations. And thank you very much, Larry. It was really a pleasure to see and hear from you, and terrific research. Thanks.
Sorry. Thank you all very much. And if anyone would like to set up, chat about this offline, I'm more than welcome. Just shoot me an email and we can find a time to chat.